So welcome to our panel. Our panel is Mediation in International Contexts, which is the role of Italy. The panel was organized by the Italian Initiative for International Mediation. Can you hear me there? Right, thank you. I was saying the panel was organized by the Italian Initiative for International Mediation that was created in 2022 with the aim to support and strengthen the Italian mediation in crisis zones in close collaboration with other relevant European and international peace mediation entities. I'm going to moderate this panel. And myself, my name is Costanza Spocci. I'm a journalist. I host a radio program on Rai Radio 3. It's called Radio Tremondo. It's a program about international politics. I've covered crises, conflicts in Middle East, North Africa, Central Asia, and Europe as well in the past decade, I would say. And here today we are with our guest. There will be three speakers here and another ambassador that will join us later, almost at the end of the panel. I would like to start actually thanking you for organizing this panel, because to talk about mediation today, I think it's extremely important, especially nowadays, if you think about the conflict that is going on in Israel and Palestine. But not only that conflict, we are in an era where mediation seems to struggle a bit. If you think about how the media coverage, and I include myself, during this conflict, but also the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, we are seeing an increasing polarization within our societies. Media coverage is dividing somehow, and it seems, from the public point of view, but also from a journalist point of view, that mediating not just between the countries that are in conflict, but also within our society, is becoming more and more difficult. So, thanks again for organizing this panel, because it's really, really, really important. And I would like to start with His Excellency, Ambassador Lambert Zegnier. And you were the OSCE Secretary General. You were the former OSCE Secretary General. I would like to ask you, since you have quite a long experience in mediation, if we think about today, if you look at your experience that you've been covering. Mediating conflict from a very specific point of view. If you think about the years that you've worked, what is the main lesson learned in these past decades that you think might be useful for us to know today?
Yeah, I certainly have quite a few opinions or views on what effective mediation can be and requires. But let me, if I may, just before answering your question, I would like just to say two words. To thank the Italian initiative for the international mediation for this initiative today, and for the manifesto. I've read the manifesto that they've issued, and I have to say I fully subscribe it. So I really like that piece of paper. I would like to encourage everybody to take a look at it, because I think it's a good starting point to develop or to consider how to develop a stronger role for Italy in mediation. So back to us and to the questions. The first point I would have to say that for a mediator to be credible, he has to be independent. What we do also in Italy, I come from a foreign office, and of course there is a diplomatic academy there, and they will do the courses. If there is any attention to international negotiation, is in the direction of preparation of negotiators. And that is very different. A negotiator is someone who has a clear objective, a clear political line, has instructions and acts on those instructions, and has to be a strong advocate of his own views. A mediator is the opposite, in my view, in many ways. A mediator has to be seen as independent, so equidistant from the sides. He has to be an excellent listener because he has to understand what are the red lines, what are the key concerns of the sides. Very often you see mediators that come up with plans and say, oh, this is what we should do for this situation. I remember Italy did that for Ukraine, and there was a plan on Ukraine. It sank in no time, and that's what happens to most of these prepared plans, because a plan must be built following discussions and engagement with the sides. So the first issue is convince the sides that they need, and this is where you need a political action. They need a space for mediation, an attempt for mediation, and then field a very credible team that is seen by mediators, by the sides as equidistant, as independent. And then in discussing with the sides and in transparent manner as much as possible, the mediator should start building a plan. Of course, he needs to have his own strategies, his own objectives, but he should not impose his ideas up front. So preparing a negotiator doesn't mean that you then have ready-made mediators to be used. The other point I would make is that you really need to have a good knowledge of the environment in which you're operating. Cultural, social, political, of course. What are the constraints? There is a lot of, and I myself set up in the OSCE a mediation support unit. There is one in the UN, and we'll talk about this in a minute. And once, when I was in Kosovo, actually, I was negotiating between Pristina. I was head of the UN mission in Kosovo. I was negotiating between Pristina and Belgrade. And New York told me, you need support, we'll send you a mediator. And they sent me a university professor from another continent who had a very generic idea of what was going on there. And yeah, he gave me some good advice technically on how to, pursue certain strands of the negotiation. But when it came to substance, I had to tell him, you sit in the back and keep your mouth shut, because there are things that you just can't say in this environment.
I was wondering, I was about to ask you actually if you could make an example. You made this example. Can we get into a bit more detail? Because you were saying, for example, when you have to mediate, you need to do that in a more transparent way possible. I imagine sometimes not that easy. And also when you were saying you need to have a good knowledge of the environment you work on. So what do you exactly mean? It means, for example, that you know how to behave, for example, during a dinner. You need to understand like cultural ways of behaving of the place.
It's not so much dinner; it's more the media. and sorry. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry for the interpreters or for the audience. I'm sorry. I'll give you some more details about my Kosovo thing, even though it's a bit, but now it's almost 15 years ago, so I can be a bit more open about it. One of the things, this was an initiative by the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon at the time, and he asked me to pursue this negotiation, so I started. The Kosovars never liked it. And I was talking to Belgrade, there was the opposition, the person who is now Prime Minister marching down the streets with a sign with Zanjerovic written on it. They interpreted me as not equidistant. So I had to find a way, and I really started engaging with them at all levels, the Kosovars. But what I also did, I started working with the friends of the Kosovars, what is called the Quint, the Americans, the Italians, the Brits, the French, etc. All countries that recognize Kosovo had an interest in having Kosovo become a full member of the international community. I think for which Belgrade was not ready, of course, unless certain conditions materialized. My plan as UN was, as the UN had been there for quite a few years and they kind of lost it, had been administering the place, but then the Kosovars declared independence unilaterally. This became extremely difficult to manage. The idea that we agreed with Brussels was to open the way for the EU to come in, because the EU could bring a European perspective and they could move the process at a different level compared to the UN. So I was working with the EU, with the Quint, and the Kosovars, I kept them informed. At the same time, I was negotiating with Belgrade. I was going like 3 times a week from Pristina to Belgrade, and it was pretty, a lot of proximity talks. They wouldn't talk directly to each other. What happened at the end of this process, and then the mediator came in, of course, I was telling you about that, and Well, he had a few problems. He had meetings without me with the Quint, and I had phone calls from the American ambassador saying, your friend told me I don't understand anything of what's going on here. So, which is not really what you want to have to deal with. And at the end, he also spoke to the media, and the media started focusing on him, which was great, because then I could continue my work, and he became the target. So I remember after last meeting in Belgrade, I advised him to go home and not come back to Pristina, because there were articles in the newspaper saying, who is this guy who came? So there may be even that element. So this is, real world things. But having said that, it really helped me structuring better the process. So that was good. At the end of the day, what happened is that I brought the conclusion of this negotiation, which was agreed by Belgrade, agreed by the Quint, and with Pristina not really liking it too much. And they were complaining with me that I should have been, whatever, bringing forward positions with the Serbs. I should have basically argued that Kosovo is independent, full stop, which of course I couldn't do. But because Kosovo is not a member of the UN, I went to the UN, I presented my report, and the report, which recommended the deployment of ULEX, which was a EU mission, and the report was agreed in the Security Council through a presidential statement. It was the first thing that was agreed in 10 years after the adoption of the initial resolution. And the day after, I transferred the whole rule of law department of the mission to the European Union, and this went on. And then the Americans, the Brits, and all others sent very high-level people to Pristina to tell the Kosovars, you need to accept this because this is in your long-term interest. And then the Kosovars started thinking about it, and then they started coming to me, thanking me for what I'd done, because they saw the European perspective starting to materialize for them. So sometimes, even after the fact, and even working with external players, you can achieve that objective.
And according to this experience, if we look at what diplomacy is nowadays, and the role of mediators, like in Italy, within Italy, if you had to suggest what is to be improved in this field, especially nowadays, if we think like in this week, in this present time, in this month, what would you suggest to do?
For Italy to play a stronger role in mediation, you mean?
I mean, yes, but also if there are mediators, they want to try to get more in touch with diplomacy and try to help. What should they do?
I would look at it the other way around. What you need is, first of all, a strong determination to have a country play a role in mediation, international mediation. And this must come at the political level, at the level of the policies of the government. We want to be seen as a bridge. Italy is in many ways a bridge between East and West, between North and South, is in the center of the Mediterranean. As Italians, we are often seen as potentially, good mediators, someone who can understand the sides and can play a useful role. Plus, we Italians also are flexible and creative, and I think in international negotiation, in my mediation, things are found that always very useful, because very often you find very clear red lines, but with some creativity you might find ways around and move things forward.
Would you make an example that you can say?
I can mention to you there is a negotiation that I ran for 2 years. It was called the modernization of the Treaty on Conventional Forces in Europe. It was in the context of the OSCE already at the time, at the end of the 90s. And it was related also to NATO-Russia relations. It had to do with the levels of military equipment in every European country. It's one of those treaties of the 90s that we need to modernize. This negotiation lasted 2 years. I was selected not as an Italian, but as I had worked in NATO, I was the head of the arms control department, the secretariat, so they knew me, and they asked me to chair the negotiation. And they told me, look, this is not really going to go very far. But then I kind of shuffled all the papers. I started working in a completely different manner. I created a number of concentric groups, starting talking with each of them in their own merit. And we moved from, sorry, it's very technical, but the original CFE treaty was based on a concept of parity between NATO and Warsaw Pact. With NATO expanding, this notion of parity didn't work anymore. Yeah. And so we had to move to a level to disaggregated figures for each country. So that each country would have a limit of the number of military forces in its own territory, both stationed and national. A number of countries said they were not ready to present numbers. So I said, you know what? Let's forget about the numbers. We work on the mechanisms, and we look at how all the mechanisms work: troops in transit, and how many, and what would be the key parameters to define the figures. And then there was a list of countries. And when it came to numbers, I put a picture of Tweety Pie, the little yellow bird, the Disney bird. I put that there, and I left it there. And then I started talking to ones and the others, the friends of the friends, and little by little the figures started surfacing. And at the end of the day, on the last day, at 3 in the morning in Istanbul, at the summit in Istanbul, we managed to have the last figure. We put it in. 8 o'clock, the treaty was signed by the heads of state and government of the OSCE. So I had written this piece of paper, and I had in front of me Clinton, Blair, Schroeder, Amato was the prime minister at the time for Italy, all coming there and signing the piece of paper I'd written. So I thought that was good. And at some point, I have a tap on the shoulder, and I find a cap on my head. And it was the American delegation, and I take the hat, and there was a Tweety Pie on the hat. So that was a funny way, but very creative way of going around something that looked really unsolvable. Another similar technique worked when I was in the OSCE. The OSCE deployed a very large monitoring mission in Ukraine, over 1,000 people, and the Russians were against it. So I remember I went to Moscow. I knew Lavrov pretty well, so we had a real tough conversation. And I told him, listen, I will make sure, we are the OSCE, you are a member of the OSCE, there will be Russian monitors in the group. It's not going to be a Western monitoring thing. Are you sure? How many? And then I looked at him and said, how much do you pay to the budget? 7%? 7%. So we do that.
Fair enough.
And he said, deal. And we did it, and then after that it worked. Then we worked on details, but it worked.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, because it's really interesting to know like the in-depth works. It really helps with the details. I hope we will have time to come back to it later with some questions from the public. Sure. But for the moment, thank you so much for
You're welcome.
For sharing this. Like from the a governmental perspective and from international organization perspectives, now we may move from the NGO perspective and how the NGOs can have a role in mediating within the conflict. And I think here we have a very good example of someone who can tell us a bit more. Anna Cervi is here at my right, and she is member of the Mediterranean Women Mediation Network, and she is the former director of NRC and the Norwegian Refugee Council in Syria. You've spent more than 5 years in Damascus. It wasn't easy, I guess, and I think you had to mediate loads of issues, many issues, in a very, very difficult context. You were on the field during the conflict, and you had to deal with one of the most difficult governments, I think, to deal with because of the amount of data and information that they had on you, on your fellows, workers. So I guess this makes everything much more difficult when it comes to mediation and negotiations. So I was wondering, there is a kind of a missing nexus between the humanitarian sector and the peace mediation one. Since you've been working for 15 years in war-torn countries, what do you think it will be helpful to make this gap a little bit smaller?
Thank you, Costanza, and let me see if I can speak closer to the microphone. It's not so easy. So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for actually joining us for this discussion today. And Costanza, a very easy question to answer. Thank you for that. But let me step back for a second. I think where I'd like to start is that what we often miss to realize is that while conflict unfolds on the ground, and to translate it into practice, while bombs are falling on the heads of people, life of people doesn't stop. People continue living if they, of course, survive the conflict. And by doing so, they find ways to talk to each other, even if they do not like each other. And even if peace has not come through on time, to support them to reconcile with what has happened, unfortunately, to them. And Syria is definitely the case in point, is an example of a conflict that has persisted for more than 13 years. So life doesn't stop, and so doesn't humanitarian aid. Humanitarian aid enters into a country at the time when people are desperately in need of the essentials, but also stays inside the country to, even if bombs are not falling anymore, but still peace is not there. And by virtue of actually happening and being in there, a lot of different sectors are covered by humanitarian aid, not just delivering food and water, to be pragmatic. You work on longer term issues, such as, for example, education, or to bring another example from my experience in Afghanistan, where I stayed 3 years, I spent 3 years working on housing, land, and property rights of Afghan people. However, this is a perfect example of how, while working on longer term issues in a country on humanitarian aid, if there is a disjoint nexus between humanitarian aid and the efforts to bring peace, and a sustainable one, to the country, all that you are doing actually fails or goes to nowhere because of what happens next to the country. Afghanistan is the case in point. I think also, at least from my perspective, and I jump back to my experience in Syria, humanitarian response, again, is not just about delivering commodities to people. It's about supporting a dialogue to resolve very concrete problems on the ground. And that dialogue is what, in reality, translates into a missed opportunity for diplomacy and for peacemaking and peace building if it's not capitalized upon. In my experience, for instance, when it comes to Syria, the fact that, for example, the diplomatic corps disengaged with the most difficult actors that were working inside, that were actually controlling the country, left humanitarian workers to do the heavy lifting of dialogue completely alone. And this is a perfect example where even if you are not supported on the ground by who has leverage, which are countries, yet dialogue doesn't stop, because problems to solve doesn't stop, especially when war continues.
And would you like, I'm always asking about examples because maybe not everybody knows the Syrian context very well. So I'm wondering if you, I imagine you felt alone in many different situations during those 5 years in Syria, but if you bring us up like an example that may let us or everybody understand what you really mean.
Yeah, for example, you find yourself working in different sectors. One of them is the sector of education. Extremely important for the whole country, but especially important for women. Why? Because women in Syria are entrusted with education at many different levels, including also in positions within the public sector. But by virtue of you not having counterparts in the country, other NGOs and the government, it's very difficult to engage in a conversation to talk about curriculum to talk about resolving traumas deriving from active conflict, to talk about support for teachers that are traumatized themselves and are actually dealing with traumatized students. And all of this basically needs to happen when war is still ongoing. So you are dealing with a longer term issue that can influence the future of the country. You are actually supporting a sector where women are in leadership positions. You start to engage with a government that doesn't want to change anything in the first place, but yet you keep going. And in this particular case, it took us a year to actually agree with the government on specific type of activities to do within this setting of education, and to ensure that different parts of these activities would then be accounted for also in the curriculum of the country. I use this example because I want to introduce also the issue of women leadership in both peace processes, but also in the humanitarian response. And again, what I was saying before in terms of missed opportunities. In a humanitarian response, but humanitarian response is there because there is a conflict ongoing or there is a disaster ongoing. And my experience on the ground has been that women have been at the forefront in many of these contexts in terms of response to the needs of their society in the midst of war. And Syria is the case in point. However, they haven't been able to have an equally leading role when it comes to finding longer-term solutions, what we call as peace, in their own countries. In the case of Syria, they are not still sitting at the decision-making table when it comes to peace mediation. Yet, they have made incredible steps forward, and this we must acknowledge, but they are still not there after 13 years. So how do we capitalize on actually this potential of dialogue, potential of leadership, even of women that are not yet completely included in processes? And that's where I actually concur with what Zanier was saying before. Either you make it a strategic priority and you actually invest or spare no efforts to make it happen. Either you decide that that dialogue that is happening on the ground in terms of humanitarian response, that leadership that is actually leading in very difficult times the humanitarian response is part of what you would like to promote, or you miss the opportunity. And I think in terms of Italian context, for example, that's where we have very strong realities. You mentioned the Mediterranean Women Mediation Network, which brings together women from the whole Mediterranean geographical area. We have very strong NGOs that are working on these themes in different countries, but also inside of Italy. And that's where perhaps we need to start. We need to start with experience we have, join it with strategic decision making, and ensure that we do not miss this opportunity, especially at these very difficult times.
You were mentioning not just the network you belong to, but other networks. I was wondering, while you were talking about Syria and how there is a need of political will actually to channel the humanitarian aid somehow, I'm wondering if we take the case of Syria, it's a conflict that is still going on, it's changing, it has chronicized, but it changes like every 5 years, and it evolves. And there are already plans of reconstruction, for example, and there are different state actors that are interested into meddling in the conflict and have somehow their foot on the ground, their hands on some parts of the Syrian government to maybe help after the conflict, I don't know, to rebuild the infrastructures, to take care of the water issue, for example. So I'm wondering how these interests from different states and actors actually clashes with some NGOs operation the humanitarian aid, and how can you eventually, strike back or try to do something to make your own space, despite all this interest coming and meddling in Syria, for example?
I must say that it is increasingly difficult to actually reply back in having and holding your grounds in an environment whereby donors and governments are polarized themselves. And therefore, this tension you described at the beginning of the panel is actually then reflected also on the ground when it comes to humanitarian response. For instance, reconstruction in Syria is not going to happen, and it's tied to a political solution to the conflict. And that's what is the stand of most of the donors. Some states might think it differently, but still, that is what actually is happening on the ground. Therefore, all the destruction that came with the conflict, all the towns that were and cities that were destroyed by the conflict, the public sector that was severely undermined by the conflict, and the private sector itself is not going to be supported until and unless peace is actually found that is agreeable by Syrians themselves, of course, but also by different players that are in the Syrian situation. So as NGOs, you are squeezed between all these different dimensions, and unless there is a political will to ensure that the dialogue moves from that corner, then oftentimes you are even constrained in, for instance, when repairing a school, not repairing it in full, but just putting plastic sheets on the window, because that is not reconstruction, whereas putting real windows is reconstruction. So this is what translates in practice the political problem into a sphere that shouldn't be political in the first place, like the humanitarian one.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thanks a lot, because like having an insight on the conflict zone, on the field, it's really important. While you were talking, I just remember in one of the past wars that happened in Gaza. I remember I was at the border, at the Rafah crossing border, which is the border between Gaza and Egypt. At the time it was possible to go there. After a few months they just closed it down, and it became impossible for international journalists and journalists anyhow to go there. But there, I remember, I don't know if you've heard about tunnels that go from the Egyptian part down. It's a spider web of tunnels and that go up to Gaza. So basically, everything is going through those tunnels. Could be fighters, weapons, could be human beings, it could be also sometimes there were like the KFC, they were ordering some hamburgers from one side to the other. You have drugs, you have olives, water, I mean everything used to go through those tunnels. Even nowadays there are less, because the Egyptian army bombed them, the most of them. But I remember after one of the war in Gaza, there was at the time still the Morsi was the president of Egypt, the elected president of Egypt. He was from the Muslim Brotherhood. He was, at that time he was sponsored by Qatar. So there was this war in Gaza before. I used to see some cement, yeah, concrete. Thank you. I didn't have the word. These concrete, huge bags that used to come from Saudi Arabia. This before Morsi became president, and I saw those ones going through the tunnels. After a while, Morsi was elected. Saudi Arabia withdrew the fundings from Egypt, and Qatar stepped in. And then, when I went back to the border again, I saw those big bags of concrete going through the tunnels to Gaza, but this time they used to come from Qatar. And this concrete was used to build, what it was used to build like the buildings in Gaza after bombardment. So just to give you another like picture of what it is, how much is weaponized also the humanitarian aid in a political way. So we were talking about the role of, I was talking about the role of Qatar and Saudi Arabia, but we're in Italy, so it's time to understand what is our role, actually. And to help us and trying to understand it, there is Simone Ceresa, and he used to be the SCCP country director in Kosovo, and he is also the founder with Anna of the Italian Initiative for International Mediation. So it's thanks to them that we are here today. So Simone, in light of your experience as a practitioner, I was wondering if you can tell us why you decided to organize this panel, why this discussion is so important in Italy in this moment.
Thank you, Costanza. Thank you, everybody, for being here today with us. It's really incredible to see so many faces. We were not expecting so much presence. It's really a pleasure and an honor. I wanted to thank you, Costanza, for joining us today and moderating the panel from a perspective of somebody who's constantly working on political international crisis. It's really important, and follow her on Radio 3 because she's really an amazing journalist. But I would like also just to say a word thanking Marco Gregorin and the Ride On agency that allowed us in the past few weeks to come also with a digital presence, which is a necessary point of starting for our reality to start on and creating our identity. Now, the question is, the way that I see it's not so much what is the Italian reality on mediation, but what could be the Italian reality on mediation. And I would start from taking the words of Ambassador Zanier, from what Anna just told us. It's an incredible, complex world. It's much more polarized than before. It is getting more and more complex. There are several issues. Climate crisis has not been mentioned, but it's a major issue pressing on many humanitarian needs everywhere. The challenges are more and more pressing. And when there are more and more challenges on, it's even more important to refine and put on the table all the weapons that you can have to throw back. So the question, the way that we see is not that every conflict is mediatable. Mediation, it's not an answer per se to everything, but it must be an ongoing effort of dialogue that is needed in order to include the voices of those who are actors in their own conflicts, heard, so that things can be slowly taken in and get back in the world. Now, what we need to do in general terms is investing in the quality of the response that the international community have, but also investing on the support to those actors, Italian or not Italians. The way we see Italian effort is always within the European framework of intervention in international conflicts, but supporting those people, those actors who are actually involved in peace and humanitarian dialogue. How can we do that? Now, we believe we study from the perspective from the ground. Every one of us joining the 3am initiative has several years experience in the ground, in the institutions, in several areas of the world. And by spending time in those areas, what we have noticed is that it's full of Italian expertise everywhere. Now, that is something that is not very much known, because when we talk about mediation, normally we always think about the Nordic countries, Switzerland. We have the incredible honor of having Ambassador Greminger, who is joining us. He will tell us a little bit what the path in Switzerland was before. But there is not so much considered they're not considered as an important actor in political mediation in the world. Now, what we see is that it's full of very high-level professional. Ambassador Zanier is absolutely a good representative of this pool everywhere. But in Italy, there is not so much a center of gravity where this incredible expert can reach out to each other, collaborate, share expertise, and then offer support to our government. And there was another question, another topic regarding the political will. Mediation can happen when there is the political of engaging. Now, the question is also what can be the political interest of Italy in engaging? what we have seen in the world is that even when you don't have a specific economic interest in certain areas, increasing your presence as a credible mediator has a return in terms of image, in terms of credibility, in terms of international status. That's the reasoning behind the beginning of the initiative.
Thank you so much for organizing this panel. Yes, I think you've deserved it. Also, like, what do you think, like, what lesson have you learned in the past years? Because I think this is also, I mean, your network has just begun, and I guess every one of you has his own expertise. So I was wondering, since there are so many young people here today, if one day they want to be like mediators, what is, if you have any advice, first of all, and if you can tell us a bit more, what was your field and what is your major lesson learned during these years?
Always easy questions. Thanks.
Of course.
It's in my own specific case, it was not something exactly foreseen from the beginning. I studied as a jurist, then I had a great interest in mediation and in mediation between victims and perpetrators and understanding the human side that there is that always happens when there is a conflict, whether it's track 3, 2, or even 1. And following that interest and the interest for human rights, I started getting involved in conflicts. Now, mediation for me was always the tool that was also closer to my own sensitivity and that I could start developing and applying the way that I could with the different hats that I had as a diplomat or as a civilian servant or as a negotiator. Now, the point is not so much about where you're going to, which kind of point you're going to achieve, where are you going to find yourself in the last, but what are your passions, what are your strong suits that you have since the beginning, the things that can you use and enhance to make you relevant to do something that you actually love while doing that. Because that's the lesson that I learned, is that people notice when you're good in doing something. And the other lesson learned, that the only one that I want to share, is that you might think that Anna, myself, I will not talk to Ambassador Zania because he does know what he does, but whenever you have the feeling that you're talking with an expert, no one does not have an imposter syndrome. All of us always do our best, but no one is always really as cool as it looks from the outside. And that for me was really important to accept, to start behaving and doing what I could, although I might have not been the best.
So what you would say, like, how would you define a good mediator then?
Ambassador Zania already did. Somebody who can listen, somebody who can read between lines, somebody who can speak an emotional language while maintaining a concrete answer. Somebody who can be not neutral, mind what he said, equidistant, being close to all the parties, and then being able to support that diplomat that will have the last word, but connecting these different words without judging.
Thank you so much also for sharing your own experience. And I don't know if Ambassador Greminger is online. Yes? So if he's hearing us. Good afternoon, His Excellency. Can you hear us? Yes. Maybe Ambassador, can you hear us? Maybe there is a technical issue.
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Great, very well. So with us, we have Ambassador Thomas Greminger. He is the Executive Director of the Geneva Center for Security Policy. and he's also the former OCE Secretary General. Ambassador, I would like to ask you, we've been sharing like different experiences, like on different levels. To you, I would like to ask if you look at the Swiss experience on supporting efforts in peace mediation, peace building, and international conflict resolutions. What are the steps, the practices, and structures that supported building a solid collaboration and or a cooperation between governmental bodies? If you can share some of your experiences with us.
Sure, with great pleasure, and thank you so much for inviting me. And really sorry that I cannot be with you in person. I would have loved to see my good old friend Lamberto Zanier again. Hopefully next time it will work out. I'm traveling, and by the way, I'm calling from Minsk. Look, after the end of the Cold War, Switzerland was faced with the challenge of having to define a new foreign policy, meaning that during the Cold War, Switzerland had hardly a foreign policy at all. Now the Swiss government looked into a number of options, and one quite prominent one was military peacekeeping. That, however, then was in the early 90s undermined by a successful referendum that prevented arming the planned Swiss Blue Helmet Battalion. So all of a sudden, another option came on the radar, and more prominently so, and that is what we call civilian peace building. Basically meaning, managing, trying to resolve conflict through mediation and facilitation as a main emphasis in this civilian peace promotion effort. And government then started supporting government started, supported by Parliament, developing tools and also made more resources available in the second half of the 90s. At first, this was mainly about supporting UN-led operations, and early on also already civil society-led work, often grassroots work. After the turn of the millennium, the resolve to strengthen this civilian peace promotion as a Swiss foreign policy tool grew stronger and stronger. And in 2003, then a separate law was adopted for civilian peace promotion, and including, and equally important, a separate credit frame, meaning a funding facility that would allow funding of civilian peace promotion over a 4-year time frame. I, back then, happened to be the director of the department in charge, the Human Security Department, and had the privilege then from basically 2003 on to build up a relatively well-stocked toolbox, and over time also a strong mediation and facilitation portfolio for Switzerland. There was, from the very outset, a very strong support by civil society actors for this, and so not surprisingly, this then also impacted on the approach that he took to conflict management and resolution. It was from the very beginning comprehensive and multi-track. And there was a strong sense in government back then that civil society actors could provide Switzerland with decisive entry points into peace processes. Let me illustrate this by 4 very specific examples of multi-track approaches. First example, Colombia. At a given time, there was a track 1 engagement in all 3 peace processes, the one with FARC, the one with ELN, and the one with paramilitaries. And the interesting thing was that access to FARC came through a Geneva-based professor that was, for quite some years, the only figure that was trusted by FARC, and kind of he was the man that had access to FARC. And so this was our comparative advantage until 2009, when President Uribe lost trust in our intermediary. But for, I would say, 7-8 years, this was basically the main reason why we got a track 1 mandate, including by the Colombian government. In parallel, we ran from the early days on a major civil society program that was called SWITCOL. Standing for Switzerland Peace in Colombia, which was supporting track 2 and track 3 civil society organizations doing work in Colombia. At times, this produced interesting bridges to track 1 efforts. At times it didn't, but there was a strong also political commitment in Switzerland that this civil society track was very important and valuable, and also made sure that civil society in Switzerland was supporting what we did generally in civilian peace promotion. Let me give you a second example, Nepal. Nepal was a long-standing development partner of Switzerland, so Switzerland had relations built over decades to civil society on the ground, including to the Maoists. And this proved decisive to have this basic trust that we needed to start engaging on the conflict. Initially, we worked through a private mediator. I think this was 2000, and from 2001 on, with the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue for quite some time to simply convince the sides that it would be worthwhile to come to the negotiation table. And then at some point, that must have been around end 2004, 2005, the sides wanted a more direct engagement by Swiss diplomacy, but short of a formal mediation mandate. So I appointed an official Swiss mediator that in turn operated through 2 so-called national mediators to then negotiate what then in 2006 became the Nepal Peace Accord. A nice example of multi-track work. Third illustration of this multi-track philosophy, there was early on, around 2001, 2002, a platform created in Switzerland that would unite all Swiss civil society actors that worked in what you would call today peace building. The platform was based at Swiss Peace, a major Swiss foundation that engages mainly in track 3 and track 2 work. There was a steering committee composed of, I think, 8-9 major representatives that was chaired by the MFA and by the director of the Human Security Department. This allowed constant exchange between state and civil society actors, and also allowed coordination of Swiss efforts. And finally, the fourth example, when all those stakeholders that engaged state and multilateral stakeholders that were engaging in mediation started creating mediation support units. We also, pondered this question in the Swiss Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and basically we reflected about two options. One, to create such a mediation support unit within the ministry, or one outside. We then decided to do it outside, also for simple reasons that we had staffing constraints within the ministry. So it was partly a pragmatic, partly a politically motivated decision to set up a mediation support project based on two actors in civil society and academia, the Center for Security Studies in Zurich at the ETH in Zurich, and again Swiss Peace. And this proved to be extremely useful. It was a fully government-financed entity that provided us with all the services that typically a mediation support unit would provide you with. Again, a nice link between, let's say, civil society and governmental actors. And these are the examples to illustrate my main message.
Really useful. Actually, anticipated my question, because you were really pragmatic. You went straight to the point, and you gave us several examples. I was wondering if you could maybe help us, since Switzerland is so advanced in the matter of diplomacy. What would be your suggestions for Italy to develop like a more deeper understanding and knowledge of the kind of mediation that Switzerland is doing? If you have any advice for our diplomacy as well, that of like what we were mentioning, or like other examples that could be implemented here.
I think what was very important in the Swiss case, that there was a political commitment that was both supported top-down and bottom-up. What do I mean by saying so? There was, this sense within government that Switzerland had to come up with something to give a better profile to its foreign policy, to kind of, Switzerland as a rich country expected to contribute to global problem solving, and here the government kind of relatively early on felt, yes, why not focus on what we call in Switzerland civilian peace promotion, which again translates mainly into conflict mediation and facilitation. At the same time, you had a lot of bottom-up support by civil society actors, by NGOs that had, some of them for quite a while, been working in grassroots mediation, that partly also track 2 facilitation efforts, and they kind of supported that very much. So the end product was a very firm political commitment. I would say end of the 90s, early first decade of the new millennium. Second, I think there was then also coming with this political a readiness to invest in developing tools, in forming mediators, and in investing in entry points. It's one thing to have trained mediators, it's another to be asked to mediate or facilitate in a peace process. And here you need to kind of invest. At times, you invest over years with no yield, and at times you're lucky, and within a couple of years, you have a tangible engagement. But this idea, that you can sit in your capital-based office and somebody calls you up and asks you to facilitate and mediate, this of course doesn't happen in reality.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Yeah, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I think, and at the end, what you perhaps also need is realistic expectations. So, you know, investments in peace are often in vain. So you need to be ready to accept failures. And when we talk about diplomacy, I think what is important is you need to be ready to partly specialize. A diplomat is not automatically a mediator or a facilitator. It's something totally different. And so you need, on the one hand, a number of diplomats that know what mediation and facilitation is all about, and then you will probably have to work and hire professional mediators that are, to an extent, outside of the system.
Thank you so much, His Excellency. Thanks a lot for participating at our panel. I know that you have to leave at 4 o'clock, and it's 4 o'clock sharp. So thank you so much.
I don't have to leave. If you have another question, I can stay. But I don't want to hijack your agenda, you know.
So we're going to take advantage of your time. So I was about to open the questions to the public. So I'm wondering, since the ambassador has a few minutes more, if somebody from the public has a question for him, it's time. It's now. Yes. Puoi venire qua. We have a question for you, Ambassador.
Well, it was on the whole. Now, is this the questions for the whole panel? No. No, I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm Stefano Gnocchi. I've been working for a long time in former Yugoslavia, which 15 years in Kosovo, and I work for the EU Special Representative and involved in this, let's say, European part of Kosovo, and I entered into the role of, let's say, mediator, but more as a doing or learning by doing. And I just wanted to ask, because you mentioned the bottom up side, because dialogue takes place top down, and often the bottom up part is not enough emphasized. And it's more of a comment that I think that this the grassroots, which is where I have you know, more experience is important, and if you would have more advice concerning a country like or a place like Kosovo, which has become, unfortunately, in recent times a bit more polarized because of also the wider geopolitical context and other difficulties, whether you would have more advice in this sense, because there we deal with communities and religious authorities and with government authorities, and anyway, I stop here not to take too much time. So, thank you.
Thank you so much for the question, Ambassador. A few minutes, then we'll leave the time to the other speakers to answer other questions. Thank you.
Okay, very briefly. I think often you see peace processes where track one actors have little interest to engage with, you know, either generally with civil society actors, not to speak of really with grassroots movements, because, you know, they're afraid this only complicates matters. It could also, you know, lead to more polarization. And you know, it would simply not be very helpful. But at the same time, I think we know by now, over a few decades of conflict resolution activities, that agreements that have been concluded that are, inclusive, where there was a strong buy-in by civil society, they're more sustainable, they have a better chance to survive. So I think we need to keep insisting to include grassroots voices. We need to be creative to create platforms that allow these voices to come in, while being realistic that, often this has not directly a positive impact. It might complicate matters, but at the end of the day, I think after all we know about conflict resolution, we cannot justify a track one process alone anymore.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Any other question for all our speakers? Sì, ma anche se non è per l'ambasciatore, sì, va bene, va bene.
Good afternoon. Hi, Thomas. I'm sure you recognize my voice. I'm Luca Frattini, and
hi, Luca.
Hi. I'm a diplomat with the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and former director at the OSCE. So I'm very pleased to see Ambassador Zanier here. We had the chance to cooperate in the recent past. It's not a question, but rather an observation. I just flew back from New York, where I attended two very significant moments in UN life. One was the voting of the resolutions, or the non-voting of the resolutions regarding the Israel-Gaza issue. And the other one being the open debate in the Security Council on women, peace and security that was launched by the Brazilian presidency. And I think we have there already two very strong building blocks for whatever strategy Italy may want to establish for international mediation in the future, because one clear element, and I think Lamberto was already mentioning this, is the incredible rise, unfortunately, of armed conflicts around the world. And the second one is the total and hugely accepted, I dare say universally accepted, need for women to be at the forefront in every mediation and peace effort. And to those two elements, I would like to add a third, which I think resonates very well with this room, which is the need to involve the young people as well, also for demographic reasons, because in many conflict areas, the youth are the vast majority of the population. The only condition that I see, and I would love to be Swiss, dear Ambassador Greminger, but in Italy there is this joke that with 3 Italians you have 4 political parties. So this may be difficult to achieve, but I'm optimistic that if the will is there, you can actually put together parliament, government, civil society, and academia to build something significant that would very much respond to our geographic position as a bridge, as it has been mentioned. Thank you.
May I quickly or briefly comment? In Switzerland, civilian peace building, so mediation facilitation, was a multi-partisan endeavor. So contrary to peacekeeping that divided the party landscape in Switzerland, you have a pacifist left wing and a right wing nationalist camp that is against. This is not the case with civilian peace promotion. Everybody basically, we have 80 to 90% majorities for the credits in parliament. And at the second point, Luca, you reminded me of obvious entry points for mediation and facilitation, and these are obviously multilateral organizations and institutions. And you know, if you are strong, if you engage in the UN, if you sit in the UN Security Council, you might have spin-offs that provide you with opportunities to either support or either to do something in parallel as a mediator or as a facilitator. Lamberto recalls what we did together in 2014 when Switzerland was chairing the OEC. He was Secretary General of the OEC. He suggested a number of extremely important tools, instruments, moves to de-escalate the then crisis in around Ukraine. And the Swiss were smart enough to pick up at least some of these tools, and together we made them happen. Among them, for instance, the special monitoring mission to Ukraine, but also I think the trilateral contact group, what later became the Normandy 4, in a way came out of suggestions that were made by a multilateral actor, that is back then the OEC Secretariat led by Lamberto, and a bilateral actor, Switzerland, was smart enough to pick these ideas up, and we implemented them together successfully.
Thank you so much. Ambassador, if you want to answer with a comment.
Yes, I would like to make, but coming back also to what Italy needs, with apologies, Thomas, if I go a little bit in this direction, but this is also the purpose of our discussion. And first of all, I agree with the things that I heard about building coalitions, having the political side, having a strong presence of women, and also
invest in education, perhaps.
Pardon?
Invest in mediators.
Of course. From what I've seen, there are two paths to play a strong role in mediation, and you could look at models. We've seen Switzerland. I attended as Secretary General. I attended for 4 or 5 years in a row an informal ministerial meeting in New York in the margins of the General Assembly, which was the ministerial meeting on mediation. And this was convened by 2 countries, always the same, Finland and Turkey. Turkey always wanted to play a strong mediation role and be seen in the UN doing that. Now, if you look at Erdogan and, Ukraine and Russia, he's been one of the few managed to engage to a certain extent. In the Middle East, after his speech at the parliament, I think he failed, but he wanted to do something. But this also shows that if you want to play a role of mediation at international level, you need to have a very high profile. In this case, it's the president saying, "I'll do it myself." The Finns are using a former president, who is Ahtisaari, who created also a strong NGO dealing with mediation, the CMI, and is involved in a number of initiatives. But his strong profile is leading in a way, and is opening the way for Finland to play a role in the international scene. But this is also a strongly sponsored national policy, similar to what Switzerland is doing in different ways, and using a broader set of mediations and this hybrid system of cooperation for a ministry and external experts. So there are many models to be, but everywhere there has to be a strong leading political figure, and supported by a very clear statement of policy in that direction. So if Italy wants to play a role, we need that up front. Then we do need also the centers of excellence and everything else. But I was saying there are 2 paths. One is supporting nationals from your country playing a role within international organizations that have themselves a role in mediation. This is what happened to me, because I was a mediator, but never with an Italian hat. I was a mediator as, well, actually in the CFE negotiations I was. but otherwise I was the UN person in Kosovo, I was the OSCE person with Russia, Ukraine, etc. So supporting nationals and helping them play a role from inside international structures or even NGOs, that can be one way. The other is the Ahtisaari model. So finding some political personalities that invest on their own international profile and lead then teams of people who can assist them.
Thank you so much. We have to close, but I would like the organizer to have the last word to comment about what we've been saying right now, and maybe if you have a message.
Yeah, I think very, very briefly, our biggest regret for today is that we haven't had enough time to actually interact with the full room, and we see a lot of students present here. So perhaps the last message we would like to share: if these themes are interesting to you, ask for events to be done. Do not just wait for someone to organize them. Do reach out. As far as we are concerned, we are always happy to actually come and engage and support. And it might be all very overwhelming what you have heard today and experiences you have seen and heard about. But if you want to actually engage in these themes, please do. It's not just a work, it's also a responsibility towards our country, but also towards humanity. So, yeah, do not give up easily, okay?
Thank you so much. We have to leave the room for the next event, but you can reach out if you want. So you have the possibility. I suggest you to do that. Thank you so much.
A special thanks to Thomas. Good to see you.
Yeah, you're most welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.
Grazie per il...
Anche dovevamo chiudere, però,
fuori,
però sono i 16, avevano detto i 15, sono i 16,
No,
va
infatti...
bene. Infatti continuiamo a guardare l'orologio per capire, no, come si poteva fare.
Anda,